The first thing I noticed was the cold. Not the comfortable cold of an air-conditioned room or a winter morning beneath heavy blankets. This was the cold of marble floors pressed against bare knees, of a body that had been kneeling so long it had forgotten how to stand. My fingers were curled against polished stone, knuckles white, and the silence around me was not empty. It was populated, filled with the soft sounds of rustling silk, restrained coughs, and the particular cruelty of people choosing not to look at you directly. I raised my head slowly. A grand hall surrounded me. Vaulted ceilings with painted murals, chandeliers dripping with pale crystal, walls dressed in deep burgundy and gold. A formal gathering. Dozens of nobles in immaculate evening wear standing in neat clusters, their conversations lowered to a murmur now that something interesting had happened at the center of the room. Something interesting, me. I was kneeling on the floor of what appeared to be a reception hall in the middle of a formal dinner, dressed in a silk robe that had clearly once been expensive and was now crumpled at the hem. My hands were trembling. My cheeks were wet. I had been crying, this body had been crying before I arrived inside it. The memories came slowly, like water seeping through cracked stone. A novel. A dangerously addictive Omegaverse BL novel I had read 3 times through in the span of 2 feverish weeks. The Sovereign's Exception. The story of Kieran Voss, the obsessive Omega second son of a fallen noble house, who had spent 4 years of his life in desperate pursuit of Duke Irian Solen, the cold and brilliant alpha who wanted nothing to do with him. Kieran Voss. I looked down at my hands, pale, elegant, slightly too thin with dark ink stains on the right index finger from what I imagined were countless unsent letters. I was Kieran Voss. The villain Omega, the cautionary tale. The character readers had argued about in comment sections with titles like Did Kieran Deserve Redemption? And Kieran was never the real problem, and here's my thesis. And I was currently kneeling on the floor of Duke Irian Solen's winter estate, in front of no fewer than 60 witnesses, apparently having just made some kind of desperate scene that I had no memory of initiating but whose consequences were settling around me like ash. Get up, I told myself, get up right now. My legs obeyed with difficulty. The body's muscles remembered the position too well, which told me this wasn't the first time Kieran had ended up here. I rose slowly, smoothing the front of my robe with hands that would not entirely stop shaking, and lifted my chin. The crowd watched. Not with sympathy, with the particular fascination of people who have witnessed something they will describe at dinner parties for years. Then footsteps, measured, unhurried, the kind that belonged to someone who had never needed to rush because the world arranged itself around them. I turned. Duke Irian Solen. If you are not subscribed yet now, please hit that subscribe button, it's completely free. Let's back to the story. Novel had described him in generous terms and still undersold him. Tall, with the kind of controlled physicality that spoke of military training and careful self-discipline. Dark hair, silver-threaded at the temples despite his relative youth. Eyes the color of deep water in winter, gray-green and utterly unreadable. He wore formal black with a single silver chain at his collar, and he was looking at me the way a physician might look at a patient who had, against all advice, made themselves worse. Not with cruelty, with exhaustion. Kieran, he said, just my name, one word, and somehow it contained everything. The history, the boundary, the finality. My throat tightened with emotions that weren't mine and also were, because I was wearing this body like a second skin, and it remembered every humiliation with perfect fidelity. I need to say something, I thought, something that isn't what Kieran was about to say. In the novel, this scene ended with Kieran screaming. A declaration so raw and so public that the Duke had no choice but to formally issue a rejection letter the following morning, which was then circulated among polite society, because that was the kind of world this was. It was the moment that sealed Kieran Voss as the story's designated embarrassment. I was not going to scream. Forgive the disruption, I said, and my voice came out quieter than I expected, steadier. I'm not feeling well, I'll see myself out. Silence. Irian's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. That was not what he had expected. The crowd stirred faintly, recalibrating. I turned before anyone could react, located the nearest exit by instinct, and walked toward it with every scrap of dignity I could manufacture from nothing. I did not run, I did not look back. The corridor beyond the hall was cold and dim, lit by wall sconces spaced too far apart. I pressed myself against the stone once I was out of sight and exhaled shakily. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Okay, I thought, okay, think. I was inside the Sovereign's exception. I was Kieran Voss, the Omega second son, the obsessive villain who spent the entire first arc making the Duke's life complicated before self-destructing spectacularly in the second. The novel's intended trajectory was clear. Kieran would escalate, embarrass himself twice more, be formally exiled from the capital's social circle, and then either reform into a minor sympathetic footnote or disappear entirely from the narrative, depending on which ending you believed was canon. The story's real romantic arc belonged to Irian Solen and Marquis Thalen Reed, the composed and quietly devoted alpha-omega pair whose bond was described as fated in the most literal sense the novel's world allowed. A matched resonance confirmed by 3 independent assessors. Documented. Official. Kieran Voss was not part of that equation. He was the obstacle, the warning, the character who loved wrong too much too publicly too without dignity. I pressed my palms flat against the cold stone wall and tried to think clearly. The body's memories were still surfacing, 4 years of them fragmentary and painful. Letters written at midnight and burned before morning, then written again. Hours spent learning the Duke's schedule not from obsession alone, I realized with growing unease, but from something that felt more like panic. Like someone circling a drain and knowing it. Like someone who understood on some level that what they were doing was wrong and couldn't stop, not because they lacked the will, but because stopping felt like freefall. That wasn't the Kieran Voss the novel had presented. The novel's Kieran had been possessive, dramatic, occasionally vindictive. He had spread a rumor about Thalen Reed's family finances during the 3rd arc. He had shown up uninvited to 3 private Solen estate events. He had, at one memorable low point, bribed a servant for the Duke's weekly itinerary. But underneath all of that, in the memories pressing up through the surface of this body like bruises discovering themselves hours after impact, there was something different, quieter, more frightened. Why were you so frightened, Kieran? A door opened somewhere further down the corridor, footsteps again, lighter this time, quicker. I straightened. A young man appeared around the corner, moving fast enough that he nearly collided with me before pulling up short. He looked perhaps 19, slight and sharp-featured, with warm brown skin and clever dark eyes that assessed me in one rapid sweep. He wore servant's formal wear, but carried himself like someone accustomed to being useful rather than decorative. Lord Voss, he exhaled with visible relief, I've been looking for you. I didn't recognize him from the novel. That was either because the novel hadn't mentioned him or because he was one of the dozens of background characters who populated scenes without names. And you are. Something flickered in his expression, brief, carefully neutralized. Sable, my lord, your personal attendant for the past 2 years. I had a personal attendant I didn't remember, of course I did. Sable, I said carefully, walk with me. He fell into step beside me without hesitation, which told me Kieran had walked corridors at strange hours often enough that this was unremarkable. We moved in silence for a moment. The carriage is already arranged, Sable said quietly, and I've sent word ahead to have your rooms prepared. Good, a pause, I weighed my next words carefully. Was anyone hurt? Another flicker, longer this time, he glanced at me sideways. No, my lord, you didn't touch anyone. That's not what I asked. He was quiet for 3 steps. Lord Carvin's daughter was embarrassed. She was standing near you when you... He stopped. When I made a scene, I finished evenly. Yes, his voice was careful, watching. My lord, are you well? The question was genuine. Underneath the professional neutrality was something warmer and more cautious. The tone of someone who had learned to ask obliquely because asking directly had not always been safe. No, I said honestly, because this body was exhausted and the night had been terrible and there was something about the directness of the answer that felt necessary. But I'm going to be. Sable looked at me for a long moment, then something in him settled almost imperceptibly like a held breath released. The carriage is this way, he said. The Voss family townhouse in the capital was beautiful in the way of things that had once been grander and were now maintained with careful dignity just above the line where decline became visible. The furniture was excellent. The staff was small. The library was the best room in the building, floor to ceiling smelling of old paper, and the particular wood oil that meant someone tended it with affection. I spent my first night in this body in that library. Not reading, at first, sitting, letting the memories settle, letting Kieran Voss's life unfold in my mind like something I was watching from a distance while also being inside it, which was disorienting in a way I was choosing not to examine too carefully. By the third hour, I had a clearer picture. The Voss family's decline had begun 12 years ago when the previous Duke Voss had made a catastrophic political alliance that collapsed inside of 2 years. Kieran's older brother Aldrin had spent the decade since rebuilding carefully, consolidating what remained of the family's social capital and financial position. He had done it largely by being steady, reasonable, and strategically invisible. Kieran had spent the same decade being the opposite. Not entirely by choice. This was the part the novel glossed over, the part that sat in the body's memories like a splinter that had never fully worked its way out. Kieran Voss had been 13 when a family acquaintance, a man named Lord Prescott Nale who moved in the orbit of the Duke's social circle, had taken an interest in shaping him. The word shaping sat wrong in my mind because what it actually meant, when I examined the memories directly, was something considerably darker. Nale had spent 3 years cultivating Kieran's fixation on Duke Irian Solen, with the careful intentionality of someone planting a very specific kind of garden. Feeding information, engineering encounters, framing the Duke as both unattainable and essential, which was a particular kind of cruelty directed at an Omega adolescent whose secondary gender had just presented and whose instincts were still forming. By the time Kieran was 16, the fixation was self-sustaining. Nale had stepped back, his investment complete. The investment being, as far as I could piece together from fragmented memories and half-understood letters, that a publicly obsessive and socially destabilizing Kieran Voss was useful to someone who wanted the Duke's attention occupied and his household disrupted during specific political negotiations. Kieran Voss had never been the villain of his own story. He had been a tool in someone else's. I set down the letter I had been reading, an old one, unsigned, directing Kieran's attention toward the Duke's upcoming attendance at a particular gala, with language so subtly manipulative it would have been impressive if it weren't so vile, and pressed my fingers against my eyes. Okay, I thought, okay. I was not going to follow the script. I was not going to escalate, not going to make scenes, not going to give whoever Prescott Nale was working for the continued disruption they had spent years cultivating. But I also could not simply stop. A sudden reversal would look like strategy to anyone watching, and there were people watching. There were always people watching in worlds like this. What I needed was something more nuanced. A change so gradual it looked like exhaustion rather than calculation. A slow withdrawal from the pattern that left no clear moment where someone could point and say that's when Kieran Voss decided to be different. I needed time, and I needed information, and I needed to not embarrass myself again for at least 2 weeks. The library clock read 3 in the morning. My lord, Sable's voice from the doorway quiet, you should rest. In a moment, I looked up at him. He was standing with a cup of something warm, not hovering, just present, which was a quality I found I was already deeply grateful for. Sable, how long have the unsigned letters been arriving? He went very still. You know about them, I said, not a question. After a long moment, he stepped into the library and closed the door behind him. 2 years, he said carefully. They started about a month after I came to work for you, I noticed because I sort the correspondence. Have you kept them? Yes, his chin lifted slightly, a small defiance. I didn't know who to tell you. The previous you didn't always respond well to direct questions. The previous me, I filed that phrasing away carefully. You were protecting yourself. I was protecting both of us, he said. I thought they might matter someday. I looked at him for a moment. 19 years old, clever eyes, 2 years of quietly cataloging evidence that something was wrong with his employer's situation, while being unable to do anything about it because no one would have listened. They matter now, I said. Like this video and subscribe to this channel. Let's back to the story. Will you show me? He studied me for a long moment with the careful attention of someone recalibrating an expectation. Then he nodded once. Yes, my lord, said Sable, I will. Outside, the capital slept beneath a winter sky, and somewhere across the city, Duke Irian Solen was reviewing documents in his study, unaware that the narrative surrounding him had just changed. And in a library smelling of old paper and wood oil, the villain Omega of someone else's story was beginning to understand what he had actually been. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of deliberate stillness, of mornings spent in the library with Sable spreading unsigned letters across the reading table like evidence at a trial, of afternoons carefully rebuilding the habits of a man who had forgot how to simply exist without urgency. 3 weeks of not writing to Irian Solen, not engineering reasons to appear in his vicinity, not allowing the body's deep-trained ache to translate into action. It was harder than I expected, not because I felt what Kieran had felt, the genuine consuming fixation had not transferred with the body, but because the absence of the usual pattern made everyone around me nervous in ways that created their own pressure. Servants watched sideways. Aldrin, my older brother, arrived unannounced on the 4th day and spent an entire dinner studying me with the careful attention of a man waiting for the other shoe to drop. You seem different, he said finally, over wine he hadn't touched. I'm tired, I replied, which was true in every possible sense. He accepted this with the practiced neutrality of someone who had long since stopped expecting explanations. But his gaze lingered in a way that told me Aldrin Voss was sharper than the novel had suggested, and that he had been watching his younger brother deteriorate for years with the helpless precision of someone who understood something was wrong but couldn't locate the source. I filed that away. Aldrin might matter later. The letters Sable had kept were 37 in total, spanning 2 years, written in 3 distinct handwriting styles that I identified as either different authors or a single author taking careful pains to vary their hand. The content followed a consistent architecture. They never gave direct instructions. They were suggestive, contextual, designed to feel like information rather than direction. The Duke will attend the Lorraine Gallery opening Thursday. I thought you want to know. Marquis Reed has been seen twice this week at the Solen estate. You understand what that means. Individually, each letter was innocuous. Together, they formed a 2-year campaign of careful emotional manipulation directed at someone whose psychological vulnerability had already been shaped specifically to receive it. Prescott Nail's name appeared nowhere in the letters. Of course it didn't. But on the 12th day, cross-referencing dates against the capital's social calendar Sable had quietly sourced for me, I found that every letter had arrived within 48 hours of Nail attending an event where Kieran had also been present. Not always the same event. Sometimes through intermediaries overlapping guest lists. Close enough to observe, far enough to deny. He's been watching you respond to each one, Sable said quietly, sitting across from me with his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, calibrating. Yes, I set down the calendar. The question is why he needs the Duke's attention disrupted. What does Irian Solen have that Prescott Nail wants? Sable was quiet for a moment. Then, there are rumors about the Eastern Trade Route legislation. The Duke has been blocking a particular amendment for 2 years, something about taxation structures for secondary-class merchants. He paused. My previous employer before this household was in trade. There was a man who benefited significantly from the current legislation gap, a man with very old money and very modern methods. I looked at him. I don't know if it's the same man, Sable said carefully. But you thought it might be relevant. I thought everything might be relevant, he said. I didn't know what you'd need. 19 years old. 2 years of keeping careful watch in a household where no one was looking at the right things, preserving evidence on pure instinct. I made a mental note that when this was over, Sable deserved considerably better circumstances than personal attendant to a noble family in graceful decline. It's relevant, I told him. Keep looking. On the 18th day, the Duke came to me. Not personally. A formal card arrived by messenger, bearing the Solen House seal in dark blue wax. An invitation to a private meeting at a neutral location, a members' reading room at the capital's secondary archive, the kind of place where conversations could occur without witnesses or social consequence. The card was brief, precise, and gave nothing away beyond the essential information. It was also completely unprecedented in the 4 years of Kieran Voss's documented history with Irian Solen. In all that time, the Duke had never initiated contact, had responded when necessary, deflected when possible, and otherwise maintained a careful distance that the novel had framed as cold indifference. I turned the card over in my hands. Why now? You're going, Sable said, not a question. Obviously. I set the card down. Press the gray wool, not the formal coat, the lighter one, and I need you to find me everything publicly available about the archive's secondary reading rooms before tomorrow morning. He was already moving, and if someone asks why you're meeting him. No one will ask, I said. No one expects this meeting to exist. The archive smelled of old paper and dust, and something faintly chemical, the particular smell of preservation. The secondary reading room was small, lined with reference volumes that no one had touched in years, furnished with 2 chairs and a low table positioned near a window that looked out onto a courtyard where pigeons moved with the important air of birds who own the space. I arrived exactly on time. Irian Solen was already there. He stood near the window, not sitting, with his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze on the courtyard. In daylight, without the formal pressure of a social event, he looked different. Not softer exactly, more precise, like seeing a structure clearly after previously only observing it under flattering or unflattering light. He turned when I entered. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a brief and quickly controlled recalibration. He had expected something other than what he was seeing. I had made deliberate choices this morning. Gray wool, simply cut. Hair pulled back without ornament. No scent enhancement, which Omegas of Kieran's social class typically wore to formal occasions. Whatever signal Kieran Voss usually projected walking into a room, I was projecting something quieter. Lord Voss, Irian said. Duke Solen? I moved to the nearer chair and sat, which was a small deliberate choice because it offered the room's dynamic position to him while removing the social awkwardness of standing across from each other. Thank you for the invitation. A brief pause, he moved to the second chair and sat with the economy of someone who didn't waste motion. You seem well, he said, with the careful neutrality of a man who wasn't sure whether that observation was accurate. Better than 3 weeks ago, I said evenly. I suspect that's why you're here. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, more like the particular attention of someone who has made an assessment and found the evidence unexpectedly coherent. I heard you left the reception early. Yes. Without incident. Yes. That hasn't happened before. His voice was flat, precise, delivering the observation without editorial. I met his eyes directly. They were, up close, less winter-cold than the novel had suggested and more carefully guarded, the eyes of someone who had learned that what showed on his face had consequences and had adjusted accordingly. I know it hasn't. The silence that followed was different from the silences in the novel's scenes, not hostile, tentative in the way of a conversation feeling for solid ground. I didn't come here to revisit the history, Irian said finally. Then why did you come? He was quiet for a moment. His gaze moved briefly to the window, then back. Because something has changed and I don't understand what, and I find I prefer to understand things. The directness of it surprised me, despite everything. The novel had not captured this in him, had framed his restraint as coldness, his precision as cruelty, his distance as contempt. But sitting across from him in a dusty reading room with pigeons outside the window and no audience to perform for, what I saw was a man who was deeply, genuinely uncomfortable with things he couldn't map. I'm still determining that myself, I said, but I can tell you what it isn't. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and placed 3 letters on the low table between us. Not all of them. 3 chosen specifically. The oldest, the one referencing Thalen Reed most pointedly, and the one I had received the morning after the reception, which suggested that a particular public declaration on my part at an upcoming gala would be beneficial to unnamed parties. Irian looked at them without touching them. What are these? Someone has been managing me, I said quietly. For at least 2 years, possibly longer. These are 3 examples of the correspondence. I have 34 more. The silence stretched. He picked up the nearest letter, the one about Thalen Reed, read it in full, set it down, picked up the third, read it, set it down with a care that told me his hands wanted to move differently and he was choosing not to let them. You're showing me these, he said finally. Yes. Why? The question was fair. I took a breath. Because if I were still the person I was 3 weeks ago, I wouldn't have found them. Or finding them, I wouldn't have understood what they meant. or understanding I wouldn't have known who to bring them to. I held his gaze steadily. The person doing this has been using me to disrupt your household and your political focus. You deserve to know. Irian was very still in the way of someone experiencing a significant internal recalibration while maintaining surface composure. You're suggesting someone orchestrated your behavior. I'm suggesting someone cultivated a vulnerability that already existed and then directed it. I paused. That's not the same as saying I have no responsibility for my actions. I do, but it's also not the same as saying I was acting alone or freely. The window light shifted as a cloud moved across the sun, and for a moment the room went slightly dim and then bright again. Irian's eyes hadn't moved from mine. The name Prescott Nail, he said slowly. Is that where this leads? My pulse sharpened. You know him. I know of him. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He sits on a minor trade subcommittee. We've had occasion to disagree on legislative matters. The Eastern Route Taxation Amendment. Something crystallized in Irian's expression, the last piece of a pattern clicking into place with an almost audible precision. He's been using you to keep my attention on personal matters, he said quietly, while the amendment moved through secondary readings. That's my current understanding, yes. The silence that followed was different again, heavier, the kind of quiet that happens when two people are processing something large in the same direction. Then Irian Solène did something the novel had never shown him doing in any scene involving Kier and Voss. He exhaled, a slow, controlled breath, but a real one, something releasing. You could have gone to your brother with this, he said. Aldrin would have gone to his solicitor, who would have taken 6 months to determine whether a case existed, by which time the amendment would have passed. I kept my voice even. You needed to know immediately. And you wanted nothing from bringing this to me? His gaze was direct, searching, but not unkind. The question of a man who has been managed and manipulated enough to require verification. I considered the honest answer. I want to stop being the instrument of someone else's agenda, I said. That's not nothing, but it's also not what you're asking about. A pause. I am not here to leverage information for access to you. If that's what this looks like, I understand why, but it isn't what it is. Irian looked at me for a long moment. Long enough that I became aware of his scent in the small room, dark wood and clean cold air, and something warmer underneath that the novel had never described because the novel had never put these two people in a room alone and let them simply be present to each other. The resonance was faint, not dramatic, nothing like the shattering pull the novel described for Irian and Thalen Reed, just a low warmth like standing near a hearth in winter, something that said familiar without yet saying anything more. Irian noticed. I could tell by the slight change in his breathing, controlled immediately but present. He said nothing. Neither did I. The Thalen Reed documentation, he said finally, returning to the letter still on the table. The bond confirmation. Yes. I accepted the assessment at the time. He said it with the flat precision of someone delivering facts rather than feelings. It was conducted by the house assessors under standard protocol. I had no reason to question it. I know, I paused carefully. I'm not questioning it now, I have no standing to. I'm only nodding that the letter referencing Marquis Reed is the most pointed of the collection, and whoever wrote it wanted Kieran. I caught myself using the third person and corrected without inflection, wanted me to believe the bond was fragile or contestable, which suggests they expected me to act on that belief in some destabilizing way. Irian was quiet for a moment, and you didn't. I found the letters before the next occasion arose. He nodded slowly. His eyes were still measuring, still careful, but the quality of the assessment had changed. He was no longer looking for a trap. He was trying to understand something that had stopped fitting the shape of what he expected. I will need copies of the correspondence, he said. I anticipated that. I reached back into my coat and produced a folded document. Sable made transcriptions of all 37. The originals are in a secured location. He took the document. His fingers didn't quite brush mine in the exchange, careful, deliberate, but the air between us shifted slightly anyway. Your attendant, Irian said, Sable. Yes. He's been keeping these for 2 years without instruction. On instinct, I said. He's perceptive and he trusted that they would matter. Irian nodded once. Good staff is difficult to find. It was an understated comment delivered in a tone that carried considerably more than the words themselves. He was acknowledging something about the world Kieran Voss had actually been living in, the absence of protection, the necessity of finding small, careful allies in the margins. I didn't respond to that directly, but I felt it. There's one more thing, I said. The next letter I received after the reception. I indicated the third document on the table. It suggests I was expected to make a declaration at an upcoming social event. The Veldram Midwinter Reception, 2 weeks from now. Something public, destabilizing, designed to coincide with a council session the following morning. Irian picked it up, read it, set it down with the same careful control. They're still expecting you to perform. Yes. And you're not going to. No, I paused, but I think someone should attend the Veldram reception, and I think whoever attends should be paying close attention to who is watching for a scene that doesn't happen. Irian was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, something that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same general territory moved across his expression. Brief, controlled, but present. You're suggesting we observe the observer, he said. I'm suggesting we let them believe the script is still running, I said, until it's too late for them to write a different one. The almost smile deepened by a fraction. Outside, a pigeon on the windowsill ruffled its feathers and departed. The courtyard was quiet in the early afternoon light. Lord Voss, Irian said finally. Yes. You are not what I expected. I held his gaze steadily. I know, a pause, neither for what it's worth are you. The quiet that followed was the first one in this world that didn't feel like it was waiting for something to go wrong. In the capital's secondary archive, 2 people who had been placed in opposition by careful and cruel design sat in a dusty reading room and began, slowly, to look at the same thing from the same side. Somewhere across the city, Prescott Nail was composing his next letter. He was about to find that his instrument had developed opinions of its own. The 2 weeks before the Veldram reception passed differently than any 2 weeks in Kieran Voss's recent memory. I knew this because the body remembered the previous patterns. The way time had moved before, thick and slow and pressurized, every hour weighted by the anticipation of the next engineered encounter, the next letter, the next occasion where the wound would be opened and examined and left open again. Time had functioned like a recurring injury for Kieran Voss. Familiar, expected, somehow still surprising in its capacity to hurt. Now it moved cleanly. I spent mornings in the library with Sable, working through the transcriptions methodically, building a timeline that mapped the letters against social events, council sessions, and the recorded progress of the Eastern Trade Amendment through its various procedural stages. The correlation was remarkable once you laid it flat. Every escalation in Kieran's documented public behavior over the past 2 years corresponded within a 10-day window to a critical juncture in the amendment's progress. Every quiet period, every month where the letters had been fewer and more subdued, corresponded to periods where the amendment was stalled or under review. Prescott Nail had been running a very precise operation. He needed you volatile during votes, Sable said on the 9th day, sitting across from me with the timeline spread between us, his voice carrying the particular flat quality of someone who has reached a conclusion they find genuinely offensive. The Duke's attention divided, his household reputation complicated by association, however peripheral, his political allies uncertain. A distracted Duke is a less effective legislative opponent, I agreed. And a Duke managing rumors about an Omega making scenes in public spaces is a Duke spending social capital on personal management instead of coalition building. It's elegant, Sable said with disgust. Like this video and subscribe to this channel. Let's back to the story. It is. I looked at the timeline. And it's also nearly over because the amendment is scheduled for its final reading 4 days after the Veldram reception. Whatever Nail needed me to do at the reception, it was meant to be the final disruption. Enough noise to fracture 1 or 2 of the Duke's remaining allied votes by association. Sable was quiet for a moment. What do you need me to do? I looked at him. In 2 weeks, the careful professional distance of his manner had relaxed slightly, not into informality, but into something more honest. He asked direct questions now. He offered observations without waiting to determine whether they were welcome. Whatever Kieran Voss had been before, I had apparently become someone Sable felt it was safe to simply speak to, and I found I valued that more than most things currently available to me in this world. I need you to find the original bond assessment documentation, I said, not the confirmation record, the preliminary assessment, the one filed before the confirmation. He looked at me steadily. You think it was altered? I think the confirmation record uses language that is unusually definitive for a first assessment. Standard protocol involves 2 stages and a waiting period. The preliminary for Irian Solen and Thalen Reed was filed and confirmed within 11 days. I paused. That's fast. Fast enough to be convenient, Sable said. Fast enough to be arranged. He nodded once. The assessment records would be in the bonding registry, secondary archive, restricted section. A pause. The same archive where you met the Duke last week. I hadn't mentioned where the meeting had taken place. Sable had simply known. I had stopped being surprised by this. I imagine, I said carefully, that a person with 2 years of experience quietly gathering information in a noble household might have cultivated some awareness of how restricted sections become less restricted under the right circumstances. Sable's expression remained entirely professional. I imagine they might, he agreed. I'll need 2 days. You have 4. He stood, gathering the timeline documents with his usual precision. At the door, he paused. My lord, his voice was slightly different. Whatever happens at the reception, you're not going to fall apart. It wasn't a question. It was something closer to a declaration on my behalf, offered quietly, as if he had decided I needed to hear it said by someone who meant it. No, I said, I'm not. He nodded once and left. On the 11th day, Irian Solen sent a second card. Shorter than the first, a single line in precise dark ink. The council session has been moved forward by 1 week. Nails doing, I suspect, we may have less time than anticipated. E.S. I read it twice, then I wrote back, equally brief, then we'll work faster, I'll come to you. KV. Sending that card required me to sit with the strangeness of it for a full minute before giving it to the messenger. 4 years of Kieran Voss's history with Irian Solen, and this was the first correspondence between them that wasn't a declaration, a deflection, or a formally worded request to stop. 2 people exchanging operational information like colleagues, which was so far outside the original narrative's architecture that I half expected the world to resist it somehow. It didn't. The Solen estate was larger than the Voss townhouse in the way that long-established power was larger than careful dignity. It didn't intimidate so much as simply exist, with the particular confidence of a place that had never needed to prove itself. The receiving room where Irian met me was plain by estate standards. No performance in it, just functional furniture and a fire, and the lingering smell of documents, and cedar that I was beginning to associate with him specifically. He was standing when I entered. He had been working. There were papers on the desk and a slightly loosened collar that he didn't adjust when I came in, which was such a small thing and somehow clarified something about how the nature of my presence in this room had shifted. The council session, I said, taking the chair he indicated without ceremony. Moved to 3 days before the Veldram reception, he confirmed, sitting across from me. If anything disrupts the vote, it now affects the session directly, not as a complication but as a cause. The timing is precise. He's accelerating because something made him nervous. I met Irian's eyes. The letter stopped 9 days ago. He hasn't sent one since the reception. Irian was still for a moment. He noticed the change in your behavior. He's been watching it for 2 weeks. He knows the disruption he expected didn't happen. He's recalculating. I leaned forward slightly. Which means he'll do something himself at the reception if I don't. He can't afford to let the session proceed with the Duke's coalition intact. What will he do? I don't know yet, but it will be designed to look organic. An incident, a rumor, a document surfacing at the wrong moment. I paused. Something that creates enough noise to fracture 1 vote. He only needs 1. Irian studied me with the careful attention that I had come to understand was not coldness but precision, his way of reading a situation by reading the person inside it. You've been thinking about this for 2 weeks. Sable and I have been thinking about it, I said. He's currently attempting to access the preliminary bond assessment documentation. Something moved through Irian's expression, complicated and quickly composed. You think the bond documentation was manipulated? I think it's possible. I don't know what we'll find. But if Nail has been managing the people around you this deliberately, the bond documentation would have been an obvious pressure point. I paused carefully. I want to be direct about something. Whatever the preliminary assessment shows, it doesn't change what you choose. I'm not bringing this to you as leverage or as an argument for anything. You deserve to have accurate information. What you do with it belongs to you. Irian looked at me for a long moment. The fire shifted beside us, a soft sound, and the light changed slightly across his face. You keep doing that, he said quietly. Doing what? Removing yourself from the equation before I've asked you to. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite even at all. You arrived in this room and immediately established that you want nothing from me. You presented evidence of manipulation and immediately clarified you have no agenda. You raise a question about my bond and immediately remove any implication of personal interest. A pause. It's very deliberate. Yes, I said it is. Why? I held his gaze. Because the person I was before this would have used every one of those moments as an approach vector. And you know that. And I need you to be able to trust that what you're seeing now is different. The only way to demonstrate a genuine absence of manipulation is to refuse every available opportunity to manipulate. A pause, even when the opportunity looks like honesty. The quiet that followed was different from the others. Irian was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before in any scene the novel had contained, something unguarded, working through something in real time without fully closing the shutter on it. Kieran, he said. The use of my given name was quiet, almost careful, as if he were testing how it sounded said without weight behind it. Something in my chest moved. I kept my face still. Yes. I reviewed the letters you gave me. He looked briefly at the papers on his desk, then back. The handwriting in the oldest ones, I had it compared against correspondence samples in my estate records. A pause. Nail's personal secretary has been employed by him for 11 years. Before that, she worked briefly as a copyist for a bonding assessor's office. I felt the connections landing one by one. A bonding assessor's office. Specifically, the office that conducted my preliminary assessment 7 years ago. His voice was controlled and precise and absolutely flat in the way of something being held very carefully still. She left that position 3 months before the assessment was filed. The fire crackled. Outside the estate windows, the afternoon had gone gray with the particular low light of winter. The assessment was fabricated, I said. I don't know that yet. His jaw tightened. But the proximity is deliberate. And Nail has had his secretary for 11 years, which predates his involvement with the amendment by 4 years, which predates his cultivation of your fixation on me by another 3. He paused. This is a longer game than I realized. He built the board, I said slowly, before he started playing. A confirmed bond with a politically neutral Omega from an established family would have stabilized my position considerably 6 years ago. I was newly invested in the title, managing the estate transition, politically exposed. Irian's voice was measured, analytical, but something harder was moving underneath it. A fabricated bond with an Omega from a family already in decline and already being managed toward instability would have been the opposite. A liability installed at the center of my personal life. But Thalen Reed isn't a liability, I said carefully. No, a pause. Thalen is a good person, whatever the origin of the documentation that isn't Thalen's doing. I know, I held his gaze steadily. Whatever we find, that doesn't change. He nodded once, but something in his expression had shifted into a territory I recognized because I had seen it in this body's memories. The particular look of someone realizing that the landscape they have been navigating was drawn incorrectly, and that everything they mapped against it needs to be recalculated from the ground up. How long, he said quietly, not quite to me, almost to himself, has every major decision in my personal life been made inside someone else's architecture? I didn't answer that. There was no answer that helped. Instead, I said, 3 days until the council session, 2 weeks until the reception. We still have time to move. He exhaled, came back from wherever he had gone, looked at me with the sharp, focused attention that meant he was choosing to be present rather than inside the weight of what we'd just uncovered. The reception, he said, you're still planning to attend. Yes. And if Nail moves before that? Then we'll need Sable's findings from the archive to move first. I paused. Can you delay the council session by 2 days? Not officially, but I can introduce a procedural query on a secondary clause that requires committee review before the full session can proceed. His expression was precise, controlled, the face of someone who knew exactly how the mechanisms of his world worked. It would buy 48 hours. Then do it, I stood. I'll hear from Sable by tomorrow evening. Irian stood as well. We were close in the small room, closer than we had been in the archive, and the low warmth that I had noticed before was present again, steadier now, less tentative. Not the sharp pull the novel described as faded resonance, nothing so dramatic. Something quieter and more durable. The feeling of standing next to something solid in uncertain terrain. He didn't move back, neither did I. Kieran, he said again, quieter. Yes. I owe you an accounting, he said. Not now, there's too much in motion, but when this is finished. A pause. I treated you as the sum of your visible behavior for 4 years without asking what was underneath it. That was a failure of judgment, and I intend to say so clearly when we have the space to do it properly. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I kept my voice even. You had reasonable evidence. I had convenient evidence, he said. There's a difference, I know the difference, I should have looked harder. I looked at him for a moment. At the carefully composed face and the eyes that were not cold, had perhaps never been cold, had simply been guarded in the way of someone who had learned that what they showed had consequences. At the man who was standing in front of me without a social performance or an audience or any reason to say what he was saying except that he meant it. All right, I said, when this is finished. He nodded. And then, with the economy of motion that characterized everything he did, he reached out and briefly, lightly, touched my hand where it rested at my side. Not a grasp, just a point of contact 3 seconds at most before he withdrew. It was the first time Irian Solen had voluntarily touched Kieran Voss in 4 years of documented history. I was very careful not to react to it, but I felt it for the rest of the walk home. Sable returned on the second day, with a face that was professionally neutral and eyes that were not. He placed a folded document on the library table between us without speaking. I opened it. The preliminary bond assessment. Original, not transcribed, bearing the office seal and the date, filed 7 years ago, 3 weeks before the confirmation record. The preliminary assessment result read, inconclusive. Resonance indicators present but below threshold for confirmation. Recommend reassessment in 6 months. I stared at it. Below threshold, reassessment recommended, 6 months. The confirmation record filed 11 days later had read, bond confirmed, full resonance alignment, assessor certification complete. 11 days, not 6 months, not a reassessment. A reversal of a professional finding with no documented basis and a signature from an assessor who, I now knew, had employed Nail's secretary 3 months before both documents were filed. He bought the confirmation, I said. Yes, Sable's voice was very quiet. In Lord Voss, there's something else. He placed a second document beside the first. Smaller, a letter on plain paper, not from Nail's correspondence style, something different. I found it filed with the preliminary. Misfiled, I think, or hidden behind another document in the folder. It was never entered into the registry. I read it. It was a letter to the assessor. Brief, formal, and damning. It instructed the assessor to file a confirmation regardless of preliminary findings. It referenced a payment schedule. It was signed with initials only, PN, but below the initials, pressed in dry ink as if added by a different hand at a different time, were 3 words. In case of need. Someone had kept this letter as insurance. The assessor, most likely, holding evidence of the instruction against the possibility of future exposure, filing it where it could be found, eventually, by someone looking in the right place. The assessor is still practicing, Sable said quietly. Yes, I looked up at him. He kept this on purpose. I think he's been waiting for someone to look, Sable said, for 7 years. I sat with that for a moment. 7 years of a man carrying the knowledge of what he'd done and what he'd been paid to do, preserving the evidence of it in a place where it might eventually surface, perhaps hoping it would, perhaps hoping someone would arrive who could use it correctly. I gathered both documents carefully. I need to get these to the Duke tonight. The carriage is ready, Sable said. I anticipated. I looked at him, Sable. My lord, like this video and subscribe to this channel. Let's back to the story. When this is resolved, I said carefully, I intend to recommend you to the Duke's household staff directly, with a significant increase in both position and compensation. You have operated with more intelligence and integrity than anyone in this situation had a right to expect from someone your age, and I want to be clear that I know that. Something moved through his expression, not a surprise exactly, more like the look of someone who had been hoping for something without letting themselves fully believe it was possible and was now recalibrating. Thank you, he said. His voice was entirely steady. His eyes were slightly bright. Don't thank me yet, I said, standing and gathering my coat. We still have a reception to survive. The Veldram midwinter reception was precisely as the novel had described it. Grand, luminous, crowded with the capital's social machinery in full decorative operation. Chandeliers threw warm light across silk and jewels. The string quartet played something seasonal and inoffensive. The marble floors reflected the candlelight back in long golden smears. I walked in with Aldrin. This had been deliberate. Arriving with my brother rather than alone accomplished two things. It signaled family stability, a unified Voss front rather than a lone Omega making independent appearances, and it gave me someone socially credible to stand beside while I watched the room. Aldrin had asked no questions. He had simply appeared at the townhouse that afternoon, looked at me with the careful measuring attention he had been deploying since my first changed week, and said, I'll come tonight, if that's useful. It was, he knew it was, he had been waiting to be asked. The room arranged itself around us as rooms did, clusters and conversations and the particular choreography of people tracking other people's positions without appearing to do so. I located Prescott Nail within 4 minutes. Medium height, well-dressed, unremarkable at first glance, positioned near the east side of the hall with the specific casualness of someone who had chosen their location deliberately. He was watching for me. I could feel the assessment from across the room. The recalibration happening in real time as I appeared without the usual signals. Quiet, composed, accompanied, not scanning the hall for eerie and solemn, not vibrating with the suppressed urgency that had apparently been Kieran Voss's standard social frequency. I watched him decide that something had gone wrong with his instrument. Then Irian arrived. He entered from the north reception entrance, which was the more formal access, accompanied by 2 estate staff and behind him Thalen Reed. The Marquis was everything the novel had described, graceful, quietly self-possessed, with the particular quality of someone who was entirely comfortable in their own company and extended that comfort outward naturally. They were not touching. They were not performing. They simply moved into the room together with the ease of people who had been in the same orbit long enough to have stopped needing to explain it. I watched Thalen Reed and thought about the preliminary assessment document now in Irian's possession, delivered last night with Sable's covering letter and my own brief accompanying note. I thought about Thalen moving through the world for 7 years under a bond confirmation that had been engineered rather than discovered, and I felt a specific kind of sadness about that which had nothing to do with my own position. Thalen Reed deserved to know the truth about their bond. Whatever they chose to do with that truth was their business and Irian's and no one else's. Nail was moving. I tracked him without appearing to, through the reflections in the hall's large side mirrors and the convenient information of Aldrin's murmured commentary beside me. Nail had broken from his position and was making his way toward a cluster of nobles near the receiving table, 2 of whom I recognized from the council alignment charts Sable had compiled as the Duke's most recently uncertain allied votes. East cluster, I said quietly to Aldrin, 3rd and 4th from the left. Aldrin didn't look. I see them. He's going to say something in the next 10 minutes designed to fracture their confidence in the Duke's personal judgment. Something that positions tonight as evidence of instability. I paused. I need witnesses near that cluster. I have 3 people I trust in this room, Aldrin said evenly. He had asked no questions for 2 weeks and had clearly been spending that time preparing for the moment when questions wouldn't be necessary. Where do you need them? Spread close enough to hear clearly. I paused. And Aldrin, I need you to know that I understand I have given you no reason to trust my judgment recently. What I'm asking requires that you trust it now. I'm asking anyway. A brief silence. Aldrin looked at me directly for the first time tonight. The look of someone who has been watching his younger brother from a worried distance for years and has just seen, for the first time, something that might be solid ground. "I've trusted your judgment for longer than you know," he said quietly. "I just couldn't always reach you." Something tightened in my chest. I kept my face still. "Go." He moved. I turned back to the room. Irian had located Nail. I could see it in the subtle shift of his positioning, the way he had moved to a vantage point that covered both the east cluster and the room's primary entrance without appearing to prioritize either. We had not spoken tonight. We had not arranged to arrive together or to appear associated. That had been deliberate too. What happened next happened in the span of perhaps 7 minutes and was, from any external view, entirely quiet. Nail reached the east cluster. Spoke. I was too far to hear, but I could see the quality of it, the confidential lean, the expression of reluctant disclosure, the performance of a man sharing something he wished he didn't know. The two uncertain council members listened with the particular attentive stillness of people receiving information that confirms a pre-existing concern. Then Aldrin's 3 people arrived at the cluster from different directions, in the natural way of guests moving through a crowded room, joined the conversation, asked questions I couldn't hear, and the quality of the cluster's attention shifted almost imperceptibly from receiving to examining. And Irian walked over. Not hurrying, not confrontationally, simply moving through the room with the ease of a man entirely at home in his own social environment, stopping near the east cluster with a mild greeting, joining the conversation as naturally as breathing. Nail looked up and found Irian Solen standing 2 feet away. The expression that moved through his face lasted less than a second. But I saw it from across the room, and I suspected Irian, at 2 feet, had seen it in considerably more detail. I moved then because the timing was right and because there was one more thing required. I crossed the hall directly, unhurried, and arrived at the east cluster from the opposite side from Irian, which meant Nail was bracketed. Nothing aggressive, simply surrounded by the specific people he least needed surrounding him, in a room full of witnesses, the night before a council session he had spent 7 years engineering. He looked at me, I looked back. "Lord Nail," I said pleasantly, "I don't believe we've spoken directly before." A beat of silence. The cluster watched. "Lord Voss," he said, his voice was controlled, his eyes were not. "No, I don't believe we have." "We have some correspondence in common, I think," I said. "Perhaps we can discuss it another time." A pause, brief, calibrated, "when you have more privacy." The color that moved through his face was not quite visible in the candlelight. But Irian, beside him, had heard every word, and the council members who formed the cluster had heard every word, and Aldrin's carefully positioned people had heard every word. Nail was a man who operated in the margins of other people's attention. He was not equipped for the alternative. He made his excuses within 2 minutes, left the cluster, crossed to the hall's exit with a composure that cost him visibly and would not, I suspected, survive the journey home. The east cluster resumed conversation. The council members were talking to Irian now, different tone, the tone of people who have just had a suspicion confirmed and are recalibrating their loyalty accordingly. I stepped back from the cluster and found a quieter edge of the room. The string quartet shifted into something slower. Around me, the reception continued in all its luminous machinery. Aldrin appeared beside me briefly, said nothing, put his hand on my shoulder for 1 moment and moved on. It was the most Aldrin had offered in years, and somehow it was exactly sufficient. Then Irian was beside me. He didn't announce himself, simply arrived, the way he moved through spaces, with the absolute economy of someone who had never needed to perform arrival. We stood side by side looking at the room. "He's gone," Irian said quietly. "Yes." The council members are reconsidering their positions. "I thought they might." A pause. "You said correspondence in common." I wanted him to know the letters existed without stating it openly. He'll spend tonight determining what I have and whether it's enough to move against him formally. I paused. "And tomorrow morning he'll find out about the preliminary assessment." Irian was still for a moment. "I sent the documentation to the council chair this afternoon," he said. The session will proceed with a full review of the bond registry process as a secondary agenda item. I exhaled slowly, and Thalen. I spoke with Thalen last night. His voice was even and careful. They were not surprised. They had their own reservations about the confirmation's speed at the time and chose not to voice them. A pause. They are composed. They have more dignity than most situations deserve. What happens now for them? That's between Thalen and the registry. They have options. He paused. They asked me to tell you specifically that they hold you no ill will for the documentation coming to light. They said the truth being available is preferable regardless of what it changes. Something loosened in my chest. That's generous. Thalen Reed is generous, Irian said simply. It's a specific and consistent quality. We stood in silence for a moment. Around us the reception moved through its final luminous hour. Kieran, Irian said. Yes. I said I owed you an accounting when this was finished. A pause. I think this is finished. I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me with the expression I had seen in pieces over the past 3 weeks, the one that emerged when he stopped managing what his face was doing and simply let it reflect what was actually present. It was a more open face than I had expected from the novel's version of him. Careful still and precise but not closed. You don't have to do that here, I said. I know, he turned slightly toward me. I want to. I waited. I watched you for 4 years, he said quietly, and I only ever saw what was directed at me. The letters, the appearances, the escalations. I did not ask what was underneath them because I told myself it wasn't relevant. That was convenient for me. A pause. You were a 19-year-old Omega from a family already in decline when Nails started his campaign, and you had no one in your life equipped to notice what was happening to you. And I was in a position to have noticed. I chose not to look. I held his gaze. You couldn't have known what you weren't looking for. No, he said, but I could have looked. A pause. I'm looking now. The string quartet played something slow and warm. The chandeliers threw their soft gold across the room and across the planes of Irian Solen's face. And I thought about Kieran Voss at 16 in an empty room reading a letter that felt like information and was actually architecture. And I thought about 4 years of careful misdirected longing. And I thought about what it meant that none of that had been real in the way the novel presented it. I care about you, Irian said. He said it with the specific directness of a man who does not make statements he hasn't fully examined first. I don't say that as an extension of the situation. I say it because over the course of 3 weeks I have watched you make choices that cost you something every single time and never once asked to be compensated for them, and that is a quality I find I cannot be neutral about. My throat was doing something I was choosing not to examine. That's a very precise way to say something imprecise, I managed. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, the almost smile fully present now. I'm precise by habit. I'm told it's occasionally frustrating. Only occasionally, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he extended his hand, open palm up in the center of the space between us, not reaching, offering the same deliberate quality that characterized everything he did, making the choice visible, putting the decision openly in front of me. I looked at his hand, at the careful, open gesture of a man who had spent years managing distance and was choosing now not to. I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, warm and steady, and the low, grounded warmth that I had noticed in 2 meetings and 1 corridor and 1 brief touch was fully present now, quiet and solid, and nothing like the dramatic, faded resonance the novel had promised for different people. It was better than that. It was chosen rather than assigned. It was 2 people standing in a room together after weeks of difficult truth-telling and finding that what remained after all the architecture was dismantled was still, quietly, something worth standing in. Shall we? Irian said softly. I looked at him. Where? Anywhere that isn't here, he said. The courtyard, I think, somewhere without an audience. You dislike public spectacle, I said. Deeply, he agreed, though I'm occasionally convinced it's worth it. His thumb moved slightly against the back of my hand. Tonight I think I'd prefer privacy. We walked out together. The reception continued behind us. The string quartet played on. The council members who had been Nail's targets spent the remainder of the evening in conversation with the Duke's allies, and by morning 2 of them had sent formal notes to the council chair confirming their positions. Prescott Nail did not attend the council session. His solicitor sent a procedural letter citing personal illness. The amendment failed its final reading by 4 votes. The bond registry review opened 3 weeks later. The assessor, who had been waiting for 7 years for someone to look in the right place, cooperated fully. Thalen Reed, who had more dignity than most situations deserved, withdrew from the capital's social season voluntarily and was reported, 6 months later, to be establishing a very successful independent estate in the eastern provinces. They sent a brief card to the Voss townhouse that read, "Good luck, mean it." In the Solène estate courtyard, the winter air was cold and clear, the kind of cold that clarified rather than punished. The stars were visible. Somewhere inside, music played distantly. Irian stood beside me, our hands still connected, looking at the sky with the expression of someone who has put down something heavy and is still adjusting to the absence of weight. "Sable," I said after a moment, "if you are not subscribed yet now, please hit that subscribe button. It's completely free. Let's back to the story." "What about him?" "I promised him a recommendation to a better position. I want to make good on that." Irian was quiet for a beat. "I have a junior archivist position that has been vacant for 4 months because I haven't found anyone I trusted with the work." A pause. "It requires exceptional attention to detail, the ability to work independently, and the specific skill of knowing when something matters enough to preserve." I looked at him. "He'd be extraordinary at that." "Yes," Irian said, "I thought he might be." He paused. "I pay well." "I'll tell him tomorrow." "Tell him tonight if you want," Irian said. "Some things shouldn't wait." I thought about Kieran Voss at 16, alone in an empty room, and Sable at 17, starting a job in a troubled household and quietly beginning to keep careful records on the chance that they might someday matter. I thought about people doing the right thing in the margins of situations that made it inconvenient, without recognition, without certainty of outcome, on nothing but instinct and a stubborn sense that the truth was worth preserving. "You're right," I said, "some things shouldn't wait." Irian turned toward me in the cold courtyard, and the starlight was unhelpful and the distant music was something slow, and he raised his free hand and touched my face with the same careful deliberateness he brought to every choice, his palm warm against my cold cheek. "Kieran," he said quietly. "Yes." "I would like to start over," he said. "Not from the beginning. I don't want to undo what we've built in these 3 weeks, but from here, from this." He paused. "If you're willing." I looked at him, at the careful open face and the warm steady hand and the man who had looked at me, finally, without the filter of 4 years of someone else's construction. "Yes," I said, "from here." He leaned forward slowly. Our foreheads touched first, a breath's distance, and then our lips met, quiet and certain, in the cold courtyard with the stars overhead and the distant music. And it was nothing like the desperate theatrical romance the novel had promised for other people in other configurations. It was real, it was chosen, it was ours. The villain Omega had never been a villain. The cold Duke had never been cold. And the story that had been built to hold them apart, carefully, deliberately, brick by brick over 7 years, had come down. What remained was theirs to write.